Have you ever looked at something completely ordinary, a song on the radio, a random phone call, a moment of silence, and suddenly asked yourself, wait, is this a sign from God? Maybe you've even begged for one. God, just give me a sign. If you've ever whispered that prayer, you're not alone. What if God has been speaking, but we've been listening the wrong way? And what if the silence isn't absence, but invitation? There was a time I thought hearing God's voice meant something dramatic. Lightning bolts, angelic visions, a booming voice in the dark. But the more I walked with faith, the more I realized the voice of God doesn't always roar. Sometimes it barely whispers. And learning to discern His voice is less about hearing something loud and more about noticing what's already near. It started one night in complete confusion. I had prayed about a decision for weeks. I was exhausted from trying to decode every little thing that happened. Was that billboard a sign? Was my friend's advice from God or just their opinion? It was like I had spiritual anxiety. I wanted clarity. What I got was quiet. But something shifted when I asked a better question. Not God, give me a sign, but God, teach me to recognize you. Discernment isn't magic. It's not about chasing spiritual signs like clues in a mystery game. Discernment is about relationship. It's the fruit of spending time with God, of learning His tone, His rhythm, His peace. And yes, sometimes He gives clear signs, but more often He gives something deeper, a quiet nudge, a sudden clarity, an interior peace that doesn't make logical sense. And other times, He allows silence, not as punishment, but as training. So we stop chasing signs and start seeking Him. One thing I've learned, God's voice always carries peace, even when it challenges you. Anxiety, pressure, manipulation, those don't come from Him. The voice of God never contradicts Scripture. He won't say one thing to you in private and something different in His Word. And the more time you spend with Him in prayer and Scripture, the more natural it becomes to tell the difference. It's like learning a song by heart. At first, you need the lyrics. You replay it over and over, but eventually, you just know the melody. That's how it is with God's voice. There was a moment I'll never forget. I was sitting in the back of a church, overwhelmed by choices. I asked for a sign. Nothing happened. But as I sat in silence, I remembered a Bible verse I hadn't read in months. It rose to the surface of my heart like a whisper. My sheep know my voice. I cried, not because of thunder, but because of recognition. He was speaking, and I knew it. So how do you discern if it's God or just your own thoughts? Start here. Is the message consistent with Scripture? Does it lead to peace or confusion? Does it draw you closer to love or to fear? Does it lead to self-gain or self-giving? And finally, are you willing to obey it if it is from Him? Sometimes we don't hear because deep down, we don't want to know. Discernment begins with surrender, not just listening, but being willing to follow. It won't always be immediate. You'll still wonder sometimes, you'll still get it wrong, but God is patient. He's not playing hide and seek with your soul. He wants to be found, and He's better at revealing than we are at recognizing. So the next time you ask, is this a sign from God? Pause, pray, listen, and remember, His silence is never rejection. His voice may come quietly, but it always carries love. There's a kind of restlessness that builds when you want an answer from God, but don't know what you're listening for. You pace, you pray, you replay moments in your head, wondering if you missed something. Maybe it was that conversation, or the timing of that email, or the way the Bible opened to a certain page. You start to feel like you're chasing God's voice through a fog, and it's exhausting. But discernment isn't supposed to wear you down. It's meant to anchor you. I used to confuse overthinking with discernment. I'd lie awake at night trying to interpret every feeling or coincidence. But that wasn't peace. It was pressure. Real discernment brings peace even before the answer becomes clear. It steadies you in uncertainty. You might still have questions, but you're not panicking for answers. And the turning point for me came when I stopped trying to interpret God like a puzzle and started inviting Him into relationship. Not God, decode this, but God, be with me here. That shift changes everything. One of the greatest gifts in the Catholic tradition is the practice of spiritual discernment. Saints throughout history, like Ignatius of Loyola, didn't just sit around waiting for signs. They paid attention to how God moved within their thoughts, feelings, and desires. They asked, what stirs in me when I move toward this choice? Where do I feel God more present, more alive, more at peace? That's not emotion alone. It's spiritual sensitivity, and we can all develop it. There was a time when I was considering a big life change. I thought I wanted clear signs. I got silence. But in the quiet, something more honest happened. I started to notice what stirred in me when I prayed about it. Some paths gave me peace. Others just stressed me out, no matter how logical they seemed. That peace, that stirring of consolation, it was God guiding gently, not shouting. And here's the thing about signs. God can use them, but they're not always as obvious as we want. He rarely writes on the wall, he writes on your heart. Sometimes the sign is the person who unexpectedly checks on you at the right time. Sometimes it's a scripture that speaks right into your situation. Sometimes it's just a silence that invites you to trust him more than the answer. The question is, are you paying attention with a heart that's quiet enough to notice? In our loud world, the voice of God often gets drowned out, not because he's not speaking, but because we're rarely silent long enough to hear. Constant noise, constant scrolling, constant commentary, it can harden our hearts to the subtle ways God communicates. That's why prayer isn't just asking, it's listening. You don't need mystical experiences to discern God's voice. You need space, honesty, and a willingness to obey even when the answer isn't what you expected. Ask yourself, are you looking for a sign that confirms your preference, or one that points you to truth? Because sometimes the sign we really need is a change in our own heart. There's one prayer I return to often. Lord, if this is not from you, take it away. And if it is, give me the courage to follow it. It's a dangerous prayer because it surrenders control, but it's also freeing. It opens the door for real discernment, the kind rooted in trust rather than desperation. The truth is, God doesn't want us to live in fear of getting it wrong. He's not setting traps. He walks with us step by step, guiding in ways that draw us closer, not confuse us more. And sometimes the answer isn't a sign. It's a deepening relationship with the one who gives peace in the waiting. So maybe the question isn't, God, is this you? But, God, am I still enough to recognize you? Because when we slow down, when we create space, when we seek him not just for answers but for his presence, we begin to hear the quiet but unmistakable whisper, I'm here, I've never left. That, more than any sign, is what our hearts are really longing to hear. It was a Tuesday morning when I sat quietly in the chapel, unsure of what to even pray. My thoughts were scattered, but my heart was hungry. I whispered a question I'd asked many times before. Lord, just show me if this is you. No booming voice came from heaven. No vision appeared before me. But something inside, something quiet and calm, began to shift. Not with answers, but with stillness. And in that stillness, I learned one of the most powerful truths of discernment. God often speaks through peace, not pressure. That moment taught me that hearing God isn't about dramatic revelations. It's about becoming a person who listens, even when nothing feels certain. We often imagine God's guidance will be loud, like thunder breaking through confusion. But in reality, his voice is usually more like a whisper that only trust can hear. And that whisper often comes in the midst of ordinary life, doing dishes, driving to work, folding laundry, moments where your mind is free enough to be present. In those spaces, God draws near in ways we didn't expect. You don't need to be a mystic or monk to hear God. You just need to be someone willing to wait. I think of how often in Scripture people misunderstood God's timing or method. Elijah expected to hear God in the wind, in the earthquake, in the fire. But God wasn't in any of those. He was in a gentle whisper. The same whisper speaks to us now, but how often do we miss it because we want fireworks? We have to become people of quiet hearts in a loud world. One thing that helped me was learning to distinguish the difference between the voice of God and the voice of fear. God's voice may challenge you, stretch you, or even call you out, but it will never shame you or make you anxious. His voice brings clarity, not chaos. It leads toward trust, not panic. Fear rushes, God reassures. It's also easy to confuse our desires with his direction. But here's the beautiful truth. Even when we're unsure, even when we make a choice that doesn't seem perfectly aligned, God doesn't abandon us. His grace is big enough to redirect, to teach, to grow us, especially through the gray areas. So how do you start listening? Begin by cultivating silence. Not just the absence of noise, but the kind of silence where you aren't performing for God, just being with Him. That's where discernment begins, not with decisions, but with relationship. Next, pay attention to what draws your heart closer to God. Is it a decision that fosters humility, love, and sacrifice? Or one that feeds pride, fear, and self-reliance? The path of God isn't always easy, but it always leads to deeper freedom. One practical tool that changed my life is the Daily Examen, a prayer from St. Ignatius that invites you to reflect on the day with God, where you felt near to Him, where you felt distant, and what those moments are teaching you. It helps you see the patterns of God's voice in your ordinary life. The more you practice this, the more you'll notice. Discernment becomes less about, should I take this job, or is this the one? And more about, what is God shaping in me through this decision? I remember once asking a priest how I'd know if something was from God. He smiled gently and said, God isn't playing hide and seek with you. If He wants to speak, He knows how to make Himself heard. Your job is to stay close enough to recognize His voice when He does. That stuck with me. There's a reason Jesus said, my sheep know my voice. You don't know His voice overnight. It's learned over time through prayer, trust, trial, and even mistakes. But as you grow in relationship, what once felt like guesswork begins to feel like a quiet confidence. Sometimes God will speak through Scripture, other times through a conversation, a homily, a deep stirring in your conscience. But often He speaks when you're not even asking, when your heart is finally quiet enough to listen. Discernment isn't about becoming perfect decision makers. It's about becoming faithful followers. And here's something freeing. God honors your desire to follow Him, even if you don't get it right every time. He's not grading your performance. He's walking with you, guiding, correcting, encouraging, always calling you deeper. So if you're waiting for a sign, maybe this is it. God is closer than you think. And maybe He's already speaking. You just haven't learned how to recognize His voice yet. Keep listening. He's not silent. He's just patient. And He's waiting for your heart to be still enough to hear what He's already whispering. I'm with you. I will lead you. Just stay near. There's something mysterious about how God leads us, how He nudges, whispers, and gently steers us when we least expect it. I used to think I needed to understand everything before I could trust Him. But over time, I've learned that discernment isn't about mastering a method. It's about becoming sensitive to a person. And that person is always drawing us closer, even through our confusion. One of the biggest shifts in my life came when I stopped asking, God, what do you want me to do? And started asking, God, who are you inviting me to become through this? It changed everything. Suddenly, the pressure to find the perfect choice faded. I began to realize that sometimes God isn't giving a specific answer because He's giving freedom. He trusts us to walk with Him in the unknown. The signs we long for may not be neon arrows. They might just be the quiet movement of grace inside our soul. I remember facing a major life decision, a job that looked perfect on paper, but something in me felt unsettled. I prayed, waited, and even fasted, but no clear answer came. Finally, I told God, if you're not going to make it clear, I'm just going to take a step. And that's when peace flooded in, not because I had the answer, but because I invited God into the decision, not just the outcome. That's the secret of discernment. Walking with God, not just waiting for Him. God rarely shows us the whole map. He gives just enough light for the next step, trusting that our hearts will stay aligned with His. And even if we veer off course, His grace is not limited by our detours. He can redeem every path we walk when we walk it with Him. The more I've talked with others, the more I realize many people believe that if something is hard, it must not be from God. But that's not always true. Sometimes the most uncomfortable choices are the most anointed. The cross was uncomfortable. Obedience is rarely convenient, yet both lead to resurrection. It's tempting to look for signs in every coincidence. A verse that comes up twice, a song that plays right after a prayer, a stranger's words that echo your thoughts. Could those be signs? Maybe, but God is not a code to be cracked. He's a Father who desires relationship. Sometimes a sign from God is less about a message and more about a movement in your heart. Do you feel drawn toward peace, generosity, courage? That's likely Him. Do you feel driven by fear, insecurity, or pressure? That's likely not. When you wonder, is this from God? Pause and ask, does this align with Scripture and church teaching? Does it lead me toward love and humility? Do trusted spiritual people in my life affirm this? Am I at peace even in the unknown? Discernment is spiritual maturity in action. It's not about getting answers, but about growing trust. I think of Jesus in the garden, sweating blood, asking the Father if the cup could pass, but saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." Even Jesus, in his humanity, wrestled with the weight of God's will. That gives me comfort. We don't need to pretend that discernment is always easy. Sometimes it feels like silence, but that silence is not absence. God doesn't always prevent the storm, but he gives clarity in the middle of it. Sometimes I've felt furthest from God right before I realized he had been guiding me all along. The unanswered prayers, the doors that closed, the relationships that faded, all of it were pieces of a bigger direction I couldn't yet see. Only later did I realize he had been speaking the whole time. I just hadn't learned his language. The language of God is love. It's consistent, patient, and often slow. If you're struggling to hear God's voice right now, don't panic. Don't assume he's far. Just be still. Create space. Turn off the noise. Even just 5 minutes a day of silent prayer can soften your heart enough to begin hearing what was there all along. And remember, God doesn't only speak to the strong. He speaks to the weak, the tired, the doubting, the confused. If you're one of those, you're in good company. The saints weren't great at discerning because they had supernatural powers. They were great at it because they surrendered day by day to the voice of love. And that voice is still speaking now. You don't need a miracle to know God's will. You need trust. He's not hiding from you. He's walking with you, sometimes behind, sometimes beside, sometimes ahead, but always near. So breathe. Keep showing up. Keep listening. And know this, when you seek him, he's already seeking you. The challenge isn't always in hearing God. It's in trusting that what you're hearing is really from him. So many of us second-guess ourselves. What if I'm just making this up? What if I want it so badly that I'm confusing my desires with his will? These thoughts haunted me in the early years of my spiritual life. But over time, I discovered something life-changing. God is not trying to trick us. He wants to be known. Learning to discern God's voice is a journey, not a one-time breakthrough. And often it requires unlearning what we've been taught to expect. We picture signs from heaven as dramatic, unmistakable events, burning bushes, thundering skies, but most of the time God speaks like he did to Elijah, not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but in the still small voice. It's subtle, yes, but it's unmistakable when your heart learns to recognize it. I remember once being offered a platform to speak publicly, a dream opportunity. I wanted it, I prayed for it, and then the offer came. But deep inside, something felt off. It wasn't fear, it was a quiet sense that the timing wasn't right. On paper, everything lined up, but in my soul I felt a check. I turned it down. Later, I saw that the organization behind it had collapsed due to integrity issues. That unease, that was the voice of God. Discernment is often more about what we feel quietly than what we hear loudly. God's voice leads to clarity, even when the path isn't easy. The enemy's voice leads to confusion, even when the option looks perfect. One builds trust, the other builds fear. But how do you tell the difference? The key is relationship. The more time you spend with God, the more you recognize what is and isn't him. Just like a mother knows her child's cry in a crowd, your soul begins to recognize the tone of the Father's whisper. And here's a comforting truth. You don't need to get it right every time. God honors the desire to please him. He works with our yes, even when our steps aren't perfect. If you genuinely seek his will and act in good faith, he can redirect you. You are not so powerful that you can ruin God's plan for your life by a single decision made in love. In fact, I've seen God speak most clearly when I let go of the pressure to perform. Sometimes clarity comes when we move, not when we sit still. Think of Abraham. He didn't wait for a 5-point plan. He moved when God said go, even without knowing the destination. That obedience opened doors he could never have imagined. You might be waiting for God to reveal the full picture, but he's asking you to trust him with just the frame. And yes, there will be seasons of silence, but silence is not a sign of abandonment. It's often a time of preparation. Like a seed beneath the soil, God's guidance often grows in the dark before it sprouts into understanding. When I couldn't hear God, I used to panic. Now I pause. I ask myself, have I already received an answer but just didn't like it? Am I too distracted to hear what's being said? Am I willing to obey whatever the answer is? Those three questions often shift everything. Discernment also happens in community. God speaks through His church, through wise friends, through spiritual mentors. Don't try to figure out your calling alone. We were never meant to. Even the saints had spiritual directors, and many times what felt unclear to me became obvious after a conversation with someone grounded in faith and love. I'll be honest, sometimes we over-spiritualize things. Not every decision requires a supernatural sign. Some choices are simply about wisdom. If God has given you peace, counsel, opportunity, and alignment with Scripture, move forward. Stop waiting for the clouds to part, but never move ahead of God's peace. If something feels rushed, manipulated, or driven by fear, slow down. God's voice never leads us to act in haste or desperation. His voice is gentle, steady, and sure, even when it challenges us. And don't underestimate the power of prayer in discerning. The Rosary, the Divine Mercy Chaplet, silent adoration, these aren't just rituals. They quiet the noise so we can hear the whisper. They clear the static in our soul so His signal comes through. Over time, I began to notice a pattern. God's voice often confirms what He's already been saying through circumstances, Scripture, and peace. When all three line up, it's usually Him. But when they don't, wait. One of the most humbling lessons I've learned is this. Sometimes God doesn't answer because He wants us to grow. In the wrestling, in the wondering, in the waiting, we learn trust. And trust is the deepest kind of faith. You don't need to hear a voice from heaven to know God is near. You just need to believe that He is, and then pay attention. The answer might come in a friend's unexpected call, in a Bible verse you weren't looking for, in a door that suddenly opens or closes. God's signs are everywhere when you're looking with a heart of surrender. He is not hiding. He is not silent. He is speaking in the quiet of your heart, in the rhythms of your day, and in the peace that comes when you say, Lord, not my will, but yours. When I finally stopped demanding signs and started desiring God more than answers, everything began to change. I no longer prayed just to get a yes or no. I prayed to know Him. And the more I came to know Him, the more naturally I began to sense what was from Him and what wasn't. There's a sacred maturity that grows when we shift from asking, what does God want me to do, to how can I love Him more in this moment? That change in posture transforms discernment. It moves us from anxiety into trust, from fear into faith. Discerning God's voice is like tuning an instrument. It takes time, repetition, silence, and deep listening. There are moments when the melody is clear and moments when it's not. But every effort to hear Him sharpens our spirit and humbles our pride. I remember a conversation with a mentor who told me something I've never forgotten. God's will is not a tightrope, it's a field. If your heart is sincerely seeking Him, you're freer than you think. That truth set me free. It reminded me that God's love is bigger than my confusion, that He's not playing hide and seek, He's drawing me closer in the search. There were times I thought I had missed God's will, when things didn't turn out the way I prayed. I doubted whether I'd heard Him right. But now I look back and see, even in those moments, He was leading me. The closed doors protected me. The unanswered prayers redirected me. The silence was still His presence, speaking in ways I didn't yet understand. God's voice doesn't always bring comfort. It often brings clarity. And clarity is what gives peace, even in hard obedience. Like when you know in your heart it's time to let go of something you love. Or when staying means sacrifice. Or when moving forward means walking into the unknown. But if His peace is there, you can trust the step. One night I sat in Eucharistic adoration, burdened with a major life decision. I had every pros and cons list possible, every opinion from friends, every scenario mapped out. But no peace, until I asked a different question. Not which choice is better, but where will I love God more? Instantly, the fog lifted. I walked out of that chapel with peace, not because I had all the answers, but because I knew I was choosing Him. That's what discerning God's will is about. It's not a formula, it's not magic, it's relationship. And in a relationship, you trust the voice of the one you love, even when the path is unclear. Over time, I've come to see that many people don't struggle to hear God. They struggle to trust that what they're hearing is truly Him. But here's the truth. God is more committed to your growth than to your comfort. If your heart belongs to Him, He will lead you, even through your doubts, even through your fears, even when you're unsure. And sometimes, God confirms His word not through signs, but through fruit. When your decision leads to love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, that's evidence of His Spirit. That's His fingerprint. That's His voice leaving a trail of grace in your wake. We also need to talk about timing. Discernment is not only about what to do, but when to do it. Sometimes God speaks yes, but the now hasn't come yet. I've learned that rushing a good thing makes it the wrong thing. God's pace often feels slow to us, but it's never off. He's outside of time, and what feels like delay is often divine alignment. If you're in a season of waiting for a sign, don't waste the silence. Let it shape you. Grow in the Word. Practice stillness. Seek counsel. Receive the sacraments. Keep showing up in prayer, even if you don't feel anything. That quiet obedience opens the channel between your heart and heaven. And if you're unsure, stay rooted. God honors stillness more than impulsiveness. He is patient with your discernment, and He invites your questions. Even saints had doubts. Even Jesus in the garden asked for another way. But they trusted the Father more than their fear. I want you to know, God's will is not a mystery meant to frustrate you. It's a pathway meant to free you. And every time you say yes, even through uncertainty, you are drawing nearer to His heart. Don't chase after signs. Chase after God. The signs will follow. And remember this, sometimes the sign you're looking for is the very peace you feel after surrendering. Not before the decision, but after. That deep, quiet knowing that you're exactly where you're supposed to be, even if it doesn't make sense on the outside. So today, let go of the fear that you'll mess it all up. Take a breath, listen, trust. God's voice is not reserved for the perfect or the super spiritual. It's for His children, and that includes you. If this journey toward discerning God's voice has spoken to your heart, I invite you to continue walking with us. Follow Think Fresh Daily for more honest stories, helpful insights, and encouragement for your spiritual life. We're building a community that doesn't have all the answers, but is learning to trust the one who does. Don't miss what's next. Your journey matters. Keep going, keep listening, and keep believing. God is speaking.